My father died on a Tuesday morning in October, holding my hand. He had asked me the night before if the leaves outside his window had turned yet. I told him they had, gold and red all the way down the hill. He smiled and said, "Good. I always liked October." Those were the last real words he spoke to me. My mother sat in the corner of that hospital room on her phone the entire time. When the monitor flatlined, she looked up, sighed, and said, "Well, someone's going to have to call the insurance company." That was the moment I understood with absolute clarity the kind of woman I had spent my entire life trying to earn love from. My name is Clara Hensley. I'm 44 years old, and this is the story of how my father, a man who never once raised his voice in anger, got the last word after all. If you're new here, I'll hit subscribe and drop a comment. I read every single one. Now let's go back to the beginning, because you need to understand who these two people were before you can understand what we put on that headstone. My father, Edmund Hensley, was the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday without writing it down. He coached Little League for 11 years straight, even after his own kids aged out. He kept hard candy in his coat pocket for the neighbor kids. He laughed at his own jokes before he finished telling them, and somehow that made them funnier. He was a mechanic for 32 years. His hands were always slightly stained with grease no matter how hard he scrubbed, and he was mildly embarrassed about that his entire life. He shouldn't have been. Those hands fixed every car on our street for free if the family couldn't afford the shop rate. Those hands built the back porch where we ate dinner every summer. Those hands held mine when I was scared of thunder until I was way too old to admit it. Everyone who met Edmund Hensley liked him immediately. He had that quality, the rare kind, where you just felt better standing next to him. My mother, Margaret, was a different story entirely. Margaret was sharp, precise, the kind of woman who ran a meeting and a household and a church committee, all with the same iron efficiency. On the surface, she was impressive, organized, put together. From the outside, people thought she was wonderful. From the inside, we knew better. Margaret had a tongue like a scalpel, and she used it selectively, only on the people who couldn't leave. Her daughters specifically. My sister Rosie and I were her favorite targets. Not all the time. Not obviously enough that anyone outside the house would notice. Just enough, and just privately enough, that we spent our entire childhoods wondering what we'd done wrong. Clara, your sister has a natural elegance you're never going to have, and that's okay. Rosie, I don't know why you insist on that laugh. It's embarrassing. Girls like you two have to work twice as hard because you didn't get the looks. She never spoke to our brother David that way. David was golden. David could do no wrong. And David, bless him, had no idea, or he chose not to see it, which amounts to the same thing. My father saw it. I know he did. I could tell by the way he'd quietly appear after one of her comments. A hand on the shoulder, an extra scoop of ice cream, an unnecessary drive to nowhere in particular, that always seemed to happen, right when we needed it most. He couldn't stop her. I understand that now, in a way I couldn't as a child. But he showed up in every way he was able to. That was Edmund. He loved in the spaces Margaret left empty. They were married for 41 years. My father died first. Congestive heart failure, 2 weeks after his 73rd birthday. The end came quickly, which his doctor said was a mercy. I'm not sure it was. I think we all needed more time, and there was never going to be enough of it. The funeral was a revelation. I say that sincerely. Over 200 people came. For a retired small-town mechanic with grease-stained hands and a tin of hard candy in his coat. They came from 3 states, old teammates from a softball league he'd played in the 80s, families whose cars he'd fixed, a woman who'd been his neighbor 40 years ago and driven 6 hours just to be there, his little league kids, now in their 30s, standing in a line outside the funeral home. Person after person pulled me aside to tell me what my father had done for them. The car he'd fixed for free after a divorce. The afternoon he sat with a grieving friend for 3 hours saying nothing, just being there. The way he'd remembered every year without fail, to call on the anniversary of someone's loss. My mother stood at the reception line in a black dress, accepting condolences, performing bereavement with her usual precision. When the neighbor woman who'd driven 6 hours told her Edmund had once helped her move an entire apartment in the rain without being asked, my mother smiled politely and said, "Yes, he was always doing things like that," like it was a mild inconvenience she'd graciously tolerated. Rosie and I chose the headstone together. It didn't take us long. We knew exactly what it needed to say. Edmund Ray Hensley, loving husband, devoted father, trusted friend, the kind of man who showed up. We had it engraved on a double plot stone because Margaret had already made clear she intended to be buried beside him. Her name and dates would be added to the bottom when the time came. That time, as it turned out, was 19 years later. Those 19 years were their own kind of story. Margaret lived well into her late 80s, which I believe was sheer determination to have the final word. In the years after my father died, she softened, slightly, in the way that hard things sometimes do when the pressure holding them in shape is removed. She was never warm, but she was occasionally, briefly, something approaching human. She never apologized. Not once. Not for anything. Not in 19 years. I stopped waiting around year 3. Rosie built a quiet life in Vermont and called Margaret every Sunday dutifully, because that's who Rosie is. I lived 40 minutes away and handled the practical things. Doctor appointments, grocery runs, the slow architecture of managing an aging parent who has never once said thank you. David sent money and visited at Christmas and considered himself an equal participant. He was not. When Margaret died peacefully in her sleep at 89 in the house she'd lived in for 50 years, it was Rosie and I who handled everything. The estate, the arrangements, the phone calls, the paperwork, and the headstone. Here's where I need you to really pay attention. The original stone was a double plot. Edmund's inscription filled the top half. His name, his dates, his words. The bottom half had been left blank, waiting. Adding Margaret's information meant going back to the monument company and having the lower section engraved. The monument company called to confirm the inscription. They needed the exact wording for Margaret's portion. Rosie and I sat at my kitchen table for a long time. We talked about our father, the 200 people at his funeral, the 6-hour drive, the hard candy, the quiet appearances after Margaret's comments, the way he loved and the spaces she left empty. We talked about our mother, the scalpel tongue, the favoritism, the 19 years of Sunday calls Rosie made without a single thank you, the hospital room where Margaret sat on her phone while Edmund held my hand for the last time. We were not cruel women. We had not spent our lives planning this. Neither of us had an agenda. But we sat at that table for a long time, and we thought about what was true. And then Rosie said, very quietly, "His half of the stone already says everything that needs to be said." I looked at her. She looked at me. We called the monument company. The stone reads in full, Edmund Ray Hensley, loving husband, devoted father, trusted friend, the kind of man who showed up. Also, Margaret, I want to be honest with you about what came next, because this isn't a story where everything gets tied up clean. David was upset, not furious. David rarely had the emotional range for it, but upset in the wounded, bewildered way of someone who had never been paying close enough attention to understand what had happened in his own home. "You could have put something kind," he said. Rosie answered him. "We put the truth." He didn't have a response to that. He hasn't brought it up since. Some of my mother's church friends noticed. There was talk. "Did you see the Hensley stone?" Small town whisper network, doing what it always does. I don't lose sleep over it. What I do think about, more than I expected to, is the first time I visited the cemetery after the engraving was done. I stood in front of that stone on a cold November morning. The leaves had come down by then, gold and red all the way down the hill, just like my father liked. I read his words. I read hers. And I felt, for the first time in a long time, like the balance of something had been quietly restored. Not dramatically, not with fanfare, just corrected, the way a picture gets straightened on a wall. You didn't realize how much it bothered you until it was level. My father never asked for recognition. He never kept score. He never once said a cruel word about Margaret to either of us, even when he had every right to. But he spent 41 years being Edmund, loving husband, devoted father, trusted friend, the kind of man who showed up next to a woman who spent those same 41 years making sure her daughters knew they weren't quite enough. The stone doesn't lie. It just lets both of those things be true at the same time, in the same place, in plain English, forever. I've thought a lot about what my father would say if he knew, and here's what I keep coming back to. I think he would laugh. That big, early laugh, the one that started before the joke was finished. I think he would shake his head slowly, and then I think he would say, "You girls always did have your mother's precision," which is the kindest thing anyone has ever called it. People ask me sometimes if I have regrets about my relationship with my mother, if I wish things had been different, if I'm angry. The honest answer is, I grieved my mother long before she died. I grieved the version of her that existed in my head when I was 7 years old. The mother I kept believing was in there somewhere. The one who would eventually say, "I see you, Clara, and you are enough." She never said it. And somewhere in my 30s, I stopped waiting for it. And that was its own kind of loss. Quieter than a funeral, but heavier in some ways. What I'm not is angry. Not anymore. Because here's the thing about growing up in a house where your father loved in all the spaces your mother left empty. You learn what love actually looks like. You learn it's not grand gestures or performance. It's not the right words at the right time for the right audience. It's showing up. It's the hand on the shoulder. It's the unnecessary drive to nowhere. It's remembering, without being reminded, that someone needs to know they matter. Edmund Hensley showed me that every single day for the first 23 years of my life. I've been trying to live up to it ever since. The stone was never about revenge. I want to be clear about that. It was about accuracy. My father's life deserved words that matched it. And the most honest thing we could say about Margaret, the truest, most precise, most accurate thing, was that she was there. Also, Margaret, she existed. She was his wife. She is buried beside him. And every morning, when the light comes up over that cemetery and hits that stone, Edmund Ray Hensley gets his full name and every word he earned. That felt right to us. That still feels right. I drive past the cemetery sometimes on my way to Rosie's place in the fall, when the leaves are coming down. I don't always stop, but sometimes I do, and I stand there for a few minutes in the quiet. I think about my father laughing at his own jokes. I think about hard candy in a coat pocket. I think about 200 people driving from 3 states for a man with grease-stained hands. And then I get back in the car and drive to my sister's house where there is always coffee on and someone genuinely happy to see me. That's the inheritance my father actually left us. Not the house, not the money, not anything you can write in a will. The knowledge of what it looks like when someone truly shows up for you, and the ability to recognize, clearly and without confusion, when someone doesn't. If you have an Edmund in your life, someone who loves quietly in the spaces others leave empty, tell them today. Don't wait for the headstone to say what you should have said while they were still in the room. And if this story reminded you that the people who truly show up deserve every word, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Drop a comment below, hit subscribe. I'll see you in the next one.